Your place is in the trash. That was the message my daughter left for me. I stood there, 70 years old, with the freezing Seattle rain soaking through my coat, staring at those 6 words scrawled in black marker on a neon yellow sticky note. The note was plastered onto my vintage leather suitcase, which was currently sitting in a mud puddle in the middle of the driveway. My daughter Madison thought she had thrown me away like yesterday's garbage. She thought she had stripped me of my dignity, my home, and my legacy. She thought I was just a useless, senile old man who would crawl away and die in the dark. She was wrong. I reached into my pocket, my fingers numb from the cold, and pulled out a permanent marker. I flipped that yellow note over and wrote just 2 words on the back. Then I stuck it right onto the driver's side window of her brand new SUV. I didn't look back as I walked away. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Then it rang again. And again. 30 missed calls. She had finally read the note. She had finally realized that the war she started was one she could never win. But before I tell you what those 2 words were, and how I brought my ungrateful family to their knees, I need you to understand how I ended up standing in the rain, locked out of the home I built with my own hands. If you have ever been underestimated by the people you sacrificed everything for, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Let me know in the comments what city you are watching from. I always try to read them all. My name is Harrison Gallagher. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I designed foundations that hold up skyscrapers against earthquakes and bridges that carry thousands of lives across the water every day. I know how to spot a crack in the concrete before the building falls. I know that the most dangerous structural failures are the ones you cannot see until it is too late. But I never saw the crack in my own family foundation until the roof came crashing down on my head. It started 2 hours before I found that note. I was coming home from the cemetery. It was the 5th anniversary of my wife Catherine's passing. I had spent the afternoon talking to her headstone, telling her about the garden, about how the hydrangeas she planted were finally blooming blue this year, and how much I missed the sound of her humming in the kitchen. The taxi ride back to the house was quiet. The windshield wipers were the only sound, a rhythmic thumping, that matched the headache pulsing behind my eyes. I was tired. Not just physical fatigue, but a deep spiritual exhaustion that settles into your bones when you are 70 and the house is too quiet. I tipped the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I looked up at the house. It was a beautiful craftsman-style home in Queen Anne overlooking the Sound. Catherine and I had bought the land 30 years ago when it was just dirt and weeds. We built it beam by beam. Every shingle, every window frame, every floorboard held a memory. I just wanted to go inside, pour a glass of scotch, sit in my leather armchair, and close my eyes. I walked up the porch steps, shaking off my umbrella. I reached for my keys, the brass ones Catherine gave me for my 60th birthday. I slid the key into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. I frowned, pulling it out and wiping it on my coat. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe my hand was shaking more than I realized. I tried again. I jiggled it. I pushed it. Nothing. The key wouldn't turn. It felt like the wrong key, but that was impossible. This was my house. This was the same lock I had installed myself 10 years ago. Then I heard the click, but it didn't come from my key. It came from the other side of the door. The deadbolt slid back and the heavy oak door swung open. I expected to see Madison. I expected her to ask why I was struggling with the door. Instead, I saw Brad, my son-in-law. He was leaning against the doorframe, looking entirely too comfortable. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car, and he had a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. My whiskey. The 18-year-old single malt I was saving for a special occasion. "Brad," I said, confused. "The lock is jamming. I think the mechanism is rusted. I need to get my toolkit from the garage." Brad didn't move. He didn't step aside to let me in. He just took a slow sip of my whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass, and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a shark gives you before it takes a bite. "The lock isn't rusted," Harrison Brad said. His voice was smooth, oily. "We changed it this morning while you were visiting the boneyard." I blinked, the rain dripping from the brim of my hat down my neck. "Changed it? Why would you change the locks without telling me? And why are you drinking my scotch?" Brad laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. He stepped out onto the porch, forcing me to take a step back down the stairs into the rain. He pointed a manicured finger toward the front lawn. "I haven't just changed the locks, old man. We changed the arrangement. Look." I turned my head. In my confusion, I hadn't looked at the yard. Now I saw it. To the left of the driveway, sitting in the mud, was a pile. It wasn't just trash. It was my life. My clothes were heaped in a chaotic mound. My books, my engineering journals, my collection of vintage vinyl records, all thrown haphazardly onto the wet grass. And sitting on top of the pile were my 2 suitcases. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is this a joke? Because I am not in the mood for jokes, Brad." "It's not a joke, Dad." The voice came from behind Brad. Madison walked out. She looked immaculate, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, contrasting sharply with my soaked, disheveled appearance. She stood next to her husband, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't love. It wasn't even pity. It was annoyance. Like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto her property. "Madison," I said, reaching out a hand. "What is happening? Why are my things on the lawn?" "Because that is where they belong," she said, cold. "And honestly, that is where you belong too if you don't get it through your thick head." "We are done, Dad." "Done," I repeated. "I am your father. This is my house." Madison rolled her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She threw it at me. It fluttered in the wind and landed in a puddle at my feet. "Not anymore," she said. "You signed the quitclaim deed 3 months ago. Remember the paperwork for the senior health insurance? You signed it all over. The house is in my name. And I decided it was time to liquidate." I felt the blood drain from my face. I remembered that day. She had come to me with a stack of documents, talking fast, looking concerned about my blood pressure and my future medical costs. She said she needed to secure my assets. I trusted her. She was my daughter. I signed where she pointed. I didn't read the fine print. I never thought I needed to read the fine print with my own flesh and blood. "You tricked me," I whispered. "We protected ourselves," Brad interjected, stepping forward. "You're getting old, Harrison. You're slipping. We couldn't let you waste this property's value. The market is peaking. We did what any smart investor would do." "Investor?" I roared, my anger finally breaking through the shock. "This isn't an investment. This is my home. I built this. I carried your mother over this threshold." "It is a house," Madison snapped. "Just wood and brick. And it is sold. The new owners take possession on Monday. We need the place empty. That means no clutter. And frankly, Dad, you are clutter." She walked down the steps, her heels clicking on the stone. She walked right past me to the pile on the lawn. She picked up my leather suitcase, the one I had traveled the world with, and she tossed it toward the street. It landed with a heavy splash in a deep puddle. She marched back to the door, grabbed a yellow sticky notepad from the entryway table, scribbled something on it, and walked back to the suitcase. She slapped the note onto the wet leather. I stared at her. This woman who I had taught to ride a bike. This woman whose tuition I had paid for by working double shifts. This woman who I had comforted when her first boyfriend broke her heart. She looked at me with dead eyes. "Your place is in the trash." She read the note aloud, ensuring I understood every syllable. I have booked you a room at the Motel 6 on the highway for a week. After that, you are on your own. Do not come back here. If you step foot on this property again, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Trespassing, I choked out. In my own home. It's not your home, Harrison. Brad sneered, putting his arm around Madison's waist. It's an asset, and it's been liquidated. Now get off our driveway before you ruin the curb appeal. They turned around and walked back inside. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. I heard the deadbolt slide home. I stood there for a long time. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the tears I refused to let fall. I walked over to the suitcase. I looked at the yellow note. I looked at the house that was glowing with warm light, a light I was no longer allowed to share. They thought I was broken. They thought I was powerless. They thought the signature on a piece of paper was the end of the story. But as I stared at the structure of the house, my engineer's eyes saw something they had missed. I saw a flaw in their plan, a structural weakness they didn't know existed. I reached into my pocket and found my marker. I uncapped it with my teeth. I wasn't just an old man standing in the rain. I was Harrison Gallagher, and I was about to bring the whole house down. Đoạn kịch bản tiếp theo đã được viết ngay bên dưới, tiếp nối liền mạch câu chuyện tuân thủ đúng yêu cầu của bạn. Viết bằng tiếng Anh cho khán giả Mỹ, không tiêu đề, không ngắt quãng giống kẻ ngôi thứ nhất đầy cảm xúc, và giữ đúng nhịp độ xung đột leo thang. I climbed into my 1998 Ford F-150. It was the only thing I owned that Madison hadn't touched, probably because she thought it was an eyesore. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, a sound that usually comforted me, but tonight it just sounded like an old beast coughing in the cold. I wiped the rain from my face and pulled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the warm glow of the living room window. I saw shadows moving inside. They were probably toasting to their victory. Let them drink. The hangover was coming. I looked at the address Madison had texted me. She had called it the Emerald City Senior Suites. It sounded nice, dignified. Maybe she wasn't completely heartless. Maybe she just wanted me out of the house so she could sell it, but still wanted me safe. I wanted to believe that. A father always wants to believe the best of his child, even when the knife is already in his back. But as I drove north, leaving the manicured lawns of Queen Anne behind, the neighborhood started to change. The coffee shops and boutiques replaced by pawn shops and used car lots. I turned onto Aurora Avenue. The streetlights here flickered. I pulled up to the address. My heart sank. The neon sign buzzed with the sound of a dying fly. It didn't say Emerald City Senior Suites. It said the Blue Star Motel. The S was burnt out, so it just read the Blue Tar. It was a single-story U-shaped building with peeling paint that looked like infected skin. There were people standing on the balcony smoking, watching me pull in with predatory eyes. This wasn't a retirement home. It was a place where people went to hide or to overdose. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. This was it. This was what my daughter thought I was worth. A flophouse on the side of a highway. I grabbed my suitcase from the truck bed. It was soaked through. I walked into the lobby, which smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner that failed to mask the scent of mold. The clerk was a young man with headphones around his neck and eyes that hadn't seen sleep in days. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Reservation for Gallagher," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He tapped on a greasy keyboard. "Madison Gallagher prepaid for 1 week. Room 104. No smoking inside. No guests after 10. Checkout is at 11 a.m. sharp next Friday." He slid a plastic key card across the counter. It was sticky. "Is there a mistake?" I asked. My daughter said this was a senior living facility. The clerk finally looked up. He laughed, revealing a chipped front tooth. "Does this look like a nursing home to you, Pops?" "This is a motel. Take the key or don't. I got customers waiting." There was no one behind me. I took the key. Room 104 was on the ground floor facing the parking lot. I pushed the door open. The air inside was heavy and humid. The carpet was a shade of brown that I hoped was the original color. There was a single bed, with a thin polyester bedspread that had cigarette burns on it. I walked into the bathroom. The faucet dripped a steady, rhythmic torture. 1, 2, 3. I looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back looked older than I remembered. His eyes were red. His skin was gray. He looked like he belonged here. I couldn't stay in this room. The smell was suffocating me. I needed air. I needed food. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I walked back out to the truck. I decided to find a diner, get a hot meal, and maybe find a decent hotel for the night. I would pay for it myself. I had my savings. I had my pension. I didn't need Madison's charity. I found a 24-hour diner a few miles down the road. I ordered a burger and coffee. When the waitress brought the check, I pulled out my debit card. It was a navy blue card from the bank I had been with for 40 years. I handed it to her with a smile. She was a nice girl, about Madison's age, but with kind eyes. She came back a minute later looking uncomfortable. "I am sorry, sir," she said softly. "The card was declined." I frowned. "That's impossible. Try it again. It must be the chip." She ran it again. Same result. Declined. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I pulled out my credit card. "Try this one." She ran it. She shook her head. Declined. Pickup card. I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I opened my banking app. I logged in. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. Then the screen flashed. Account balance $12.45. I stared at the number. The numbers didn't make sense. Yesterday, there was over $200,000 in there. My retirement fund. The money from the sale of my patents. The emergency fund Catherine and I had saved. I tapped on the transaction history. It was a bloodbath. Transfer to B. Coleman, $20,000. Transfer to crypto exchange, $50,000. Transfer to Madison Gallagher, $100,000. Bill payment credit card payoff, $30,000. All dated today. All authorized by the joint account holder. I sat there frozen. The waitress was watching me with pity. That look, I hated that look. It was the same look Madison had given me. The look you give to a helpless animal. I realized then what the paperwork meant. The papers Madison had me sign 3 months ago. She said it was to help me manage my bills if I got sick. It wasn't just a deed to the house. It was a durable power of attorney. It was full access to my accounts. She hadn't just evicted me. She had erased me. "Sir," the waitress said, "is there someone you can call?" I said. My voice sounded hollow. "There is no one." I dug into my pockets. I found a crumpled $10 bill and a handful of quarters. It was just enough to cover the burger. I didn't have enough for a tip. I left the money on the table and walked out. I couldn't go back to the motel room. I couldn't stomach the smell. I climbed into the back of my truck. I had a sleeping bag back there, part of my old camping gear. I crawled inside the sleeping bag, curling up into a ball as the temperature dropped. I was 70 years old. I was a structural engineer. I was a husband. And now I was sleeping in a truck bed in a parking lot, bankrupt and homeless. I lay there listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof of the truck cap. I closed my eyes and I saw Brad's face. I saw the way he smirked as he drank my whiskey. I saw Madison's cold indifference. They thought they had won. They thought that by taking my money and my house, they had taken my power. But they forgot something. They forgot that you don't judge the strength of a foundation when the sun is shining. You judge it when the storm hits. And the storm was here. I didn't sleep that night. I spent every hour plotting. I replayed every conversation, every document I had signed. My mind, sharp as a tack, despite the exhaustion, began to dismantle their scheme like I used to dismantle faulty bridges. Morning came with a gray, bleak light. My joints ached as I climbed out of the truck. I was hungry, cold, and dirty. But I had a purpose. I needed to get back to the house. Not to beg. Not to argue. I needed to get the one thing money couldn't buy. The one thing that proved I existed before they tried to delete me. Catherine's music box. It was a small wooden box with inlaid pearl that I had bought for her in Vienna on our honeymoon. It played Clair de Lune. It was sitting on the mantelpiece in the living room. If they were selling the house, they would throw it away. To them, it was just old junk. To me, it was her soul. I used the last of my gas to drive back to Queen Anne. I parked 2 blocks away so they wouldn't see the truck. I walked through the alleyway approaching the house from the back. I knew the code to the garage keypad. I had installed it. I prayed they hadn't changed that too. I punched in the numbers. 1, 9, 7, 4. Our wedding year. The keypad beeped green. The heavy door groaned and began to roll up. Thank God for Brad's laziness. He had changed the front door lock to keep me out, but he hadn't bothered to reset the garage code because he probably never used it. I slipped under the door before it was fully open and hit the button to close it. I was in. The garage was empty except for a few boxes marked trash. I didn't look in them. I moved to the door connecting the garage to the kitchen. It was unlocked. I stepped into the kitchen. It was silent. The house smelled different. It smelled of cleaning chemicals and emptiness. The warmth was gone. I crept into the living room. There it was. The music box. It was still on the mantel right where Catherine had left it. I felt a lump in my throat. I reached for it, my hands trembling. Well, look who the cat dragged in. I spun around. Brad was standing at the top of the stairs. He was wearing a silk robe holding a cup of coffee. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. I told you, Harrison, he said, walking down the stairs slowly. If you come back, I call the cops. I just want this, I said, clutching the music box to my chest. That's all. I will leave. Brad reached the bottom of the stairs. He walked over to me. He was taller than me, younger, stronger. He reached out and grabbed the box from my hands. Hey! I shouted, trying to grab it back. He shoved me. It was a casual shove, but I was weak from hunger and lack of sleep. I stumbled back and fell onto the hardwood floor. My hip hit the ground hard. Pain shot up my spine. Brad looked at the box in his hands. He turned it over. Vienna. Nice. Probably worth a few bucks at a pawn shop. It's not for sale, I gritted out, trying to stand up. Give it to me. Brad smiled. He held the box out as if offering it to me. I reached for it. Then he opened his hand. The box fell. It hit the floor with a sickening crunch. The wood splintered. The delicate mechanism inside shattered. A spring bounced across the floor with a pathetic ping. Oops, Brad said. Butterfingers. I stared at the broken pieces of my wife's memory. The music was dead. You are garbage, Harrison, Brad said, stepping over the wreckage. Just like this box. Broken. Old. Worthless. Now get out before I decide to drag you out. I didn't attack him. I wanted to. I wanted to tear him apart. But I knew I couldn't win a physical fight. Not now. Not like this. I slowly pushed myself up. I didn't say a word. I knelt down and picked up a single shard of the pearl inlay. It was sharp. It cut into my palm, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt the focus. I looked at the trash can near the kitchen island. Brad had thrown some papers in there earlier. I could see the edges of them. As I walked past the trash can toward the back door, I stumbled on purpose. I reached out to steady myself on the can, and in one fluid motion, I grabbed a handful of the crumpled papers. I walked out the back door. I didn't look back at Brad. I didn't look back at the broken music box. I walked back to my truck in the alley. I sat in the driver's seat and smoothed out the papers I had stolen. They were torn, coffee-stained, and wrinkled, but they were legible. I pieced them together on the dashboard. It wasn't just junk mail. It was a final notice from an online gambling site. Account B. Coleman. Outstanding balance $700,000. Immediate payment required. And underneath that, another letter. A foreclosure warning on a condo in downtown Seattle that I didn't even know they owned. I started to laugh. It started as a chuckle and turned into a deep, raspy belly laugh that hurt my ribs. They didn't sell the house because I was old. They didn't steal my money because they were greedy. They did it because they were drowning. Brad was a gambler, a loser, and he had dragged my daughter down with him. They were desperate. They needed the cash from the house sale to pay off the sharks before Monday. That meant they were on a deadline. That meant they were vulnerable. I looked at the house one last time. They broke my music box. They broke my heart. But they just handed me the blueprint to their destruction. I started the truck. I wasn't going back to the motel. I had one stop to make. I needed to see a man about a land lease. I needed Bennett. I climbed into my 1998 Ford F-150, the one vehicle Madison hadn't bothered to sell because she considered it an eyesore. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, a sound that usually comforted me with its reliability. But tonight, it just sounded like an old beast coughing in the cold, damp air. I wiped the rain from my face with my sleeve and pulled out of the driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, I saw the warm golden glow of the living room window. I saw shadows moving inside. They were probably toasting to their victory, clinking glasses filled with my scotch. Let them drink. They didn't know that the hangover was coming, and it was going to be brutal. I looked down at the address Madison had texted me earlier. She had called it the Emerald City Senior Suites. It sounded nice, dignified even. For a fleeting second, a pathetic part of me wanted to believe that she wasn't completely heartless. Maybe she just wanted me out of the house to stage it for the sale, but still wanted me to be safe and comfortable. A father always wants to believe the best of his child, even when the knife is already buried deep in his back. I told myself that maybe it was a misunderstanding, that this new place would be a clean, quiet apartment complex where I could gather my thoughts and plan my next move. But as I drove north, leaving the manicured lawns and tree-lined streets of Queen Anne behind, the city started to change. The coffee shops and boutique clothing stores were replaced by pawn shops with barred windows and used car lots under harsh floodlights. The smooth pavement turned into potholed asphalt that made the empty truck bed rattle. I turned onto Aurora Avenue, a stretch of road known more for its shadows than its light. My stomach tightened. This wasn't where you sent someone you loved. This was where you sent someone you wanted to forget. I pulled up to the address and hit the brakes. My heart didn't just sink, it crashed. The neon sign above the entrance buzzed with the irritating sound of a dying fly. It didn't say Emerald City Senior Suites. It said the Blue Star Motel. But the S and the T were burnt out, so it just read the Blue R. It was a single-story U-shaped building with peeling paint that looked like infected skin under the sickly yellow streetlights. There were people standing on the balcony, huddled in coats that looked too thin for the weather, smoking and watching me pull in with predatory eyes. A siren wailed in the distance, getting closer. This wasn't a retirement home. It was a place where people went to hide from the law or to overdose in peace. I parked the truck in a spot away from the street, trying to keep my few remaining possessions safe. I sat there for a moment, the rain hammering against the metal roof. This was it. This was what my daughter thought I was worth. A flophouse on the side of a highway. I grabbed my wet suitcase from the passenger seat and stepped out. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, stale cigarette smoke, and something sweet and rotting that I didn't want to identify. I walked into the lobby. It was a small glass box that smelled of industrial cleaner, failing to mask the scent of mold. The clerk was a young man with headphones around his neck and eyes that hadn't seen sleep in days. He didn't look up when the bell on the door chimed. He was too busy tapping on a smartphone with a cracked screen. "Reservation for Gallagher," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound like the structural engineer I was, not the homeless old man I had become. He didn't stop tapping. "Madison Gallagher, prepaid for 1 week. Room 104. No smoking inside. No guests after 10. Checkout is at 11 a.m. sharp next Friday. If you lose the key, it is $50. He finally looked up, sliding a plastic key card across the scratched counter. It was sticky to the touch. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my wet coat and the expensive suitcase. He smirked, revealing a chipped front tooth. "Does this look like a nursing home to you, Pops?" he asked, seeing the confusion on my face. "This is a motel. Take the key or don't. I got customers waiting." There was no one behind me. I took the key. It felt heavy in my hand, like a sentence. Room 104 was on the ground floor facing the parking lot. I walked along the walkway, stepping over puddles and avoiding eye contact, with a couple arguing loudly in room 102. I pushed the door to 104 open. The air inside was heavy, humid, and stagnant. The carpet was a shade of brown that I hoped was the original color, but the dark stains near the bed suggested otherwise. There was a single bed with a thin polyester bedspread that had cigarette burns on it, little black craters in the cheap fabric. I walked into the bathroom. The faucet dripped a steady, rhythmic torture. 1, 2, 3. I looked at myself in the mirror. The glass was cracked in the corner. The man staring back looked older than I remembered. His eyes were red. His skin was gray. He looked like he belonged here. I felt a wave of nausea. I couldn't stay in this filth. My instinct was to leave, to find a hotel, any hotel. But then I remembered the look in Madison's eyes. She wanted me to break. She wanted me to crumble so she could justify what she had done. If I let this room defeat me, I was proving her right. I was proving I was just trash to be discarded. No, I wasn't trash. I was Harrison Gallagher. I built foundations. I created order out of chaos. I took off my coat and rolled up my sleeves. I went back to the front desk and asked for cleaning supplies. The clerk laughed at me, but he handed over a bottle of bleach and a rag. I went back to room 104, and I went to work. I scrubbed the bathroom tiles until my fingers were raw. I wiped down every surface, every handle, every switch. I stripped the bedspread off and threw it in the corner, deciding I would sleep on top of my own coat if I had to. I organized my few books on the nightstand, aligning them perfectly with the edge of the table. I hung my shirts in the open closet, spacing the hangers exactly 2 inches apart. It took me 3 hours. The room still smelled like a motel, but it was clean. It was ordered. It was a small, pathetic fortress, but it was mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands smelling of bleach, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I had reclaimed this small space. I had refused to live in their squalor. But as the adrenaline faded, the hunger set in. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. My stomach growled a hollow, painful sound. I realized I needed food. I needed fuel if I was going to fight this war. I grabbed my wallet and walked out to the truck. I found a 24-hour diner a few miles down the road. It was bright and noisy, smelling of bacon and coffee. I sat in a booth and ordered a burger and black coffee. When the food came, I ate it slowly, savoring every bite. I felt human again. When the waitress brought the check, I pulled out my debit card. It was a navy blue card from the bank I had been with for 40 years. I handed it to her with a polite smile. She was a nice girl about Madison's age, but with kind eyes that didn't hide secrets. She walked to the register. I watched her run the card. She frowned. She ran it again. She looked at the card, then wiped the strip on her apron and tried a third time. She walked back to the table, looking uncomfortable. "I am sorry, sir," she said softly, keeping her voice low so the other customers wouldn't hear. The card was declined. I frowned. "That is impossible. I have over $200,000 in that account." "Try it again. It must be the chip reader." She shook her head. "It says insufficient funds, sir. Do you have another card?" I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I pulled out my credit card. "The one with the $20,000 limit. Try this one." She took it. She came back 30 seconds later. Her face was pale. "Declined," she whispered. "Pickup card." The bank ordered us to confiscate it. I sat there frozen. The noise of the diner faded away. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I opened my banking app. I logged in. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. Then the screen flashed. Account balance $12.45. I stared at the number. It didn't make sense. Yesterday, that number had 6 figures. I tapped on the transaction history. It was a bloodbath. Transfer to B. Coleman, $20,000. Transfer to crypto exchange, $50,000. Transfer to Madison Gallagher, $100,000. Bill payment credit card payoff, $30,000. All dated today. All authorized by the joint account holder. I realized then what the paperwork meant. The papers Madison had me sign 3 months ago. She said it was to help me manage my bills if I got sick. It wasn't just a deed to the house. It was a durable power of attorney. It was full access to my accounts. She hadn't just evicted me. She had erased me. She had stripped me of 40 years of hard work in a single afternoon. "Sir," the waitress asked gently, "is there someone you can call?" I looked up at her. Her face blurred through the tears I was fighting back. "No," I said, my voice sounding hollow like it was coming from a ghost. "There is no one." I dug into my pockets. I found a crumpled $10 bill and a handful of quarters I kept for parking meters. It was just enough to cover the burger. I didn't have enough for a tip. I left the money on the table, feeling the shame burn my cheeks. I walked out into the rain, a man who had built skyscrapers now unable to buy a hamburger. I had nothing. No home, no money, no family. But as I stood in the rain, clutching my phone, the shame began to harden into something else. Something colder. Something stronger than concrete. They had taken my money. They had taken my house. But they had made a fatal mistake. They left me with nothing to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. I sat in the cab of my truck, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm on the metal roof. It was the only sound in the world, drowning out the distant hum of the highway and the chaotic noise of my own thoughts. I stared at the phone screen in my hand until the numbers started to blur. $12.45. That was it. That was the sum total of my existence. A lifetime of waking up at 5 in the morning, of working double shifts, of saving every penny for a rainy day, had been reduced to the price of a cheap lunch. And it was raining harder than it ever had before. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. I needed to see it again. I needed to understand the anatomy of the betrayal. In the diner, it had been a shock, a physical blow to the chest. Now, in the cold silence of the truck, it was a forensic examination. I scrolled down the transaction history, my thumb hovering over the red numbers that marked the exit of my life's work. There it was, glaring at me in black and white. A transfer of $50,000 to a platform called Crypto King. I didn't even know what that was. I barely knew how to use the banking app on my phone. But Brad knew. Brad, with his slicked-back hair and his get-rich-quick schemes, he knew exactly how to navigate the digital underworld. I could imagine him sitting in my living room, maybe drinking my coffee, tapping away on his tablet, gambling away my security on invisible coins that didn't exist. I scrolled further. Another transfer. $20,000 to a debt collection agency I had never heard of. Then the big ones. $100,000 transferred directly to an account ending in 4092. Madison's personal account. The account I had helped her open when she went to college. The account I used to deposit her allowance into so she could buy books and pizza. Now the flow had reversed, but without my permission. She hadn't just taken the money, she had siphoned it. She had drained me dry with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, but this time it wasn't just emotional. It was physical. A sharp cramping pain in the center of my stomach. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since a piece of toast at breakfast, and that felt like a lifetime ago. I had walked out of that diner, leaving my last $10 on the table, too proud to beg, too ashamed to admit I couldn't afford a tip. Now the adrenaline was fading, and the primal gnawing hunger was taking its place. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was just past 9 p.m. I had $12. I could go to a gas station. I could buy a sandwich. But then I had no gas in the tank. The needle was hovering dangerously close to the empty line. If I bought food, I couldn't drive. If I bought gas, I would starve. And tomorrow, what about tomorrow night? I didn't have enough for another night at the motel. I was trapped in a mathematical equation that had no solution. Desperation is a strange thing. It makes you do things you never thought you would do. It makes you lower your standards until they are lying in the dirt. I leaned over and popped open the glove compartment. It was a mess of old receipts, tire pressure gauges, and maps that were 20 years out of date. I dug through the clutter, my hand searching for anything that might be edible. I found a pack of gum that was hard as a rock. I found a half-empty roll of mints that were covered in lint. I kept digging. My fingers brushed against something crinkling in the back. I pulled it out. It was a package of peanut butter sandwich crackers. The bright orange plastic was faded. I looked at the expiration date. They had expired 8 months ago. I remembered buying these. I had bought them on a road trip to the coast last summer, thinking I might get hungry on the drive. I had thrown them in there and forgotten about them. Now they were a lifeline. I tore the package open. The crackers were stale, crumbling into dust as I lifted them to my mouth. The peanut butter had turned into a hard, dry paste. But I didn't care. I shoved them into my mouth, chewing frantically, trying to trick my stomach into thinking it was a meal. They tasted like cardboard and old oil. I choked them down, swallowing dry without even a bottle of water to wash them down. As I ate the last cracker, licking the orange dust from my fingers, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were hollow. My hair was matted with rain. I looked like a wild animal scavenging for scraps. Is this who I was now? Harrison Gallagher, the man who had designed the structural integrity of the city library, eating expired crackers in a cold truck, hiding from the world. A tear escaped, hot and angry, tracking through the grime on my cheek. I wiped it away furiously. I wouldn't cry for them. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Just as the silence began to settle back in, my phone buzzed in my lap. It vibrated against my leg like a warning. I picked it up, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was a mistake. Maybe the bank had flagged the transactions as fraud. Maybe they were calling to say they had frozen the accounts and were returning my money. Hope is a dangerous thing. It rises up even when you are drowning. I unlocked the screen. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from the banking app. A secure message. I tapped it open. The text was short, professional, and final. Notification of account closure. Dear customer, per the request of the joint account holder, Madison Gallagher, the checking account, ending in 883 has been officially closed. Any remaining balance has been issued via cashier's check to the primary address on file. Thank you for banking with us. I read it twice. Then I read it again. Closed. It wasn't just empty. It was gone. She hadn't just taken the money. She had burned the bridge so I couldn't even try to cross back. She had closed the account to ensure that even if I deposited a pension check, even if I found $1 on the street, I couldn't use that bank anymore. She had cut the cord. And the check, the remaining balance of $12.45. It was being mailed to the primary address. My house. Her house. She had even taken the last $12. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. It landed face down. The darkness of the truck cab felt absolute now. I was erased. Financially, legally, I didn't exist. I was a ghost, haunting a Ford F-150. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The hunger was still there, a dull ache now, but it was overshadowed by a new feeling. A cold steel sensation in my gut. They thought this was the end. They thought that by taking my resources, they had taken my fight. They thought that a 70-year-old man with no money and no home would just fade away into the night. Another statistic, another forgotten elder. But they didn't know about the land lease. They didn't know about the separation of title. And they certainly didn't know that hunger doesn't just make you weak. It makes you focused. It sharpens your senses. It wakes up the predator that has been sleeping inside you for years of comfort. I wasn't just hungry for food anymore. I was starving for justice. And as I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain, I knew one thing for sure. I was going to get fed. And they were going to be the ones to pay the bill. The sun came up gray and unforgiving. I had spent the night curled in the bed of my truck, wrapping my coat tight against a dampness that seemed to seep right into the marrow of my bones. My stomach was a knotted fist of hunger, aching from the lack of food, but as I sat up and rubbed the fog from my eyes, I realized that the hunger was secondary. There was an emptiness inside me that was far more dangerous than starvation. It was the void where my dignity used to be. I watched the house from down the street. It sat on the hill like a fortress I had built for an enemy. At 8:30 in the morning, the garage door opened. Madison's white SUV backed out. She was probably heading to meet with the real estate agents, or perhaps to spend more of the money she had stolen from me. I waited until her taillights disappeared around the curve of the neighborhood. Then I waited 10 more minutes just to be sure. I turned the key in the ignition. The truck grumbled, but started. I didn't drive up the driveway. I parked in the alleyway behind the property, a narrow service road that the garbage trucks used. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I wasn't a thief. I was the owner of this house. But today I had to break into my own life. I walked to the small side door of the detached garage. It was a door I had installed myself 20 years ago, reinforced steel with a keypad entry I had wired personally. Madison and Brad never used this door. They probably didn't even know the code. They were people of remote controls and automatic sensors. They didn't understand the mechanics of things. I punched in the numbers. 1, 9, 7, 4. The year Catherine and I were married. The keypad beeped a soft, compliant green. The lock clicked open. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. At least the house still remembered me, even if the people inside didn't. I slipped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust, the scent of my old workshop. But it was empty. My tools were gone. The workbench was bare. They had cleared it out. I moved to the connecting door that led into the kitchen. I turned the knob. Unlocked. Brad's laziness was my only ally. I stepped into the kitchen and stopped cold. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The house didn't just look different. It felt dead. The warmth was gone. The smell of Catherine's lavender potpourri was replaced by the chemical sting of industrial cleaning solvent. I walked into the hallway, my boots making soft thuds on the hardwood floor I had laid down with my own hands. The living room was stripped. The Persian rug was gone. The paintings were taken down, leaving ghost squares of cleaner paint on the walls. It looked like a skeleton. But my eyes went straight to the fireplace mantel. My breath hitched. It was still there. The music box. It was a small, delicate thing made of rosewood with mother-of-pearl inlay. I had bought it for Catherine in Vienna on our honeymoon. We couldn't really afford it back then, but she had looked at it with such wonder that I spent our last traveler's checks to get it. For 40 years it had sat on that mantel. Every night before bed, Catherine would wind it up and it would play a tinny sweet version of Clair de Lune. It was the heartbeat of this house. I moved toward it, my hands trembling. I just wanted to hold it. I just wanted to salvage one piece of her before this house was turned over to strangers. I reached out my fingers inches from the smooth wood. Well, look who the cat dragged in. The voice came from the stairs. My blood ran cold. I spun around. Brad was standing on the landing. He was wearing a silk robe that I recognized as one of my old Christmas gifts, but it looked ridiculous on him. He was holding a mug of coffee, looking down at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. "I told you, Harrison," he said, descending the stairs slowly, like a king coming down to greet a peasant. "If you come back, I call the cops." That was the deal. I didn't back down. I couldn't. I looked him in the eye. "I am just here for this," I said, my voice raspy. I pointed to the music box. "It has no value to you. It is broken. It doesn't play right anymore." But it was hers. "Let me take it and I will leave." Brad reached the bottom of the stairs. He walked over to the mantel, placing himself between me and the box. He picked it up. He held it in one hand, turning it over carelessly. "Vienna," he read the inscription on the bottom. "Rosewood." You know, I Googled this. These vintage boxes can fetch a couple $100 on eBay. Not a fortune, but enough for a nice dinner. "It is not for sale," I said, stepping forward. "It is mine. Give it to me, Brad." He laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Everything in this house is ours now, old man. You signed the papers. That means the furniture, the fixtures, and the trash. And this is just old junk." He tossed the box into the air and caught it. My heart lurched in my chest. "Please," I whispered. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I hate begging. But for Catherine, I would beg. "Please, just let me have it." Brad looked at me. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of humanity in his eyes. But then he smiled, and the cruelty of it was breathtaking. "You know what, Harrison, you are right. It is junk. We were just going to throw it in the dumpster anyway." "Then give it to me," I said, reaching out my hand. Brad held the box out. I took a step closer, relief washing over me. My fingertips brushed the wood, and then he pulled it back. "Oops," he said. He opened his hand. He didn't toss it. He just let gravity take it. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the box fall. I lunged for it, my old knees screaming as I threw myself toward the floor. But I was too slow. The box hit the hardwood. There was a sickening crunch. The delicate rosewood shattered. The internal mechanism, the brass drum and the comb that held the music, sprang apart with a dissonant ping. The lid snapped off. Pieces of pearl inlay scattered across the floor like broken teeth. I fell to my knees. I stared at the wreckage. The song was dead. The last voice of my wife was silenced. I looked up at Brad. He was sipping his coffee, looking at the mess with mild annoyance. "Look at that," he said. "Butterfingers. Now you have made a mess on the clean floor." Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was quiet. It was the sound of a cable finally giving way under too much tension. I tried to stand up. I wanted to grab him by the throat. I wanted to squeeze the life out of him. I lunged at him, but I was 70 years old. I was starving. I was weak. Brad was 35 and full of adrenaline. He didn't even spill his coffee. He just stepped back and shoved me hard in the chest. I flew backward. My hip hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud. Pain exploded up my spine, white and hot. I lay there gasping for air, looking up at the ceiling I had painted 5 years ago. "You are pathetic," Brad sneered. "Look at you. You are just like that box Harrison. Broken, old, useless. You don't even have the strength to stand up in your own house." He stepped over me, his slipper kicking one of the wooden shards into my ribs. "Get out," he said, turning his back on me to walk into the kitchen. "Before I decide to drag you out and throw you on the curb with the rest of the garbage." I lay there for a long moment. The physical pain in my hip was throbbing, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. But the emotional pain, that was gone. It had vanished the moment the box hit the floor. Sadness is a heavy coat. It weighs you down. But rage is fire. It burns the weight away. I slowly rolled onto my side. I pushed myself up to a sitting position. My hand brushed against the debris of the music box. My fingers closed around a piece of the wood. It was a shard of the lid, sharp and jagged where it had splintered. The pearl inlay was still embedded in it, hard and cold. I gripped it. I squeezed it until the sharp edge cut into my palm. I felt the warm trickle of blood. The pain was clarifying. It woke me up. I looked at Brad's retreating back. He thought he had defeated me. He thought he had broken a helpless old man. He didn't understand what he had just done. He hadn't just broken a music box. He had broken the last restraint I had. He had broken the part of me that still cared about being a father, about being civil, about being family. I stood up. My hip screamed, but I ignored it. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I just stood there clutching that sharp piece of wood in my bleeding hand. I looked at the trash can where Brad had been standing earlier. I saw papers sticking out of it. The gears in my mind, the engineer's mind that solved impossible problems, began to turn. They weren't turning with grief anymore. They were turning with calculation. I picked up the shard. I put it in my pocket. It would be my reminder. Brad shouted from the kitchen. "I am calling the police in 2 minutes." I didn't answer. I turned and walked toward the back door. But as I passed a mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. The man in the glass didn't look tired anymore. He didn't look sad. His eyes were cold. They were dead calm. They were the eyes of a man who was about to bring the whole structure down. I walked out into the rain, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the heat of the fire Brad had just lit. And I knew exactly what I was going to burn first. I walked out the back door, leaving the shattered remains of my wife's music box behind. I knew if I stayed 1 second longer, I would have done something that would put me in a jail cell, and I needed to be free to execute what was forming in my mind. As I passed the kitchen island, my eyes locked onto the stainless steel trash can. It was overflowing. Brad had been sloppy. He always was. Right on top, partially obscured by coffee grounds and eggshells, was a pile of shredded paper. Not cross-shredded, just ripped by hand as if someone had done it in a fit of rage. I didn't stop to think. I reached in and grabbed a handful of the debris, shoving the damp, sticky mess into my coat pocket. I made it back to my truck without being seen. I drove straight back to the motel, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, making my hands shake on the wheel. When I got to room 104, I locked the door and dumped the contents of my pocket onto the small stained table. It was a jigsaw puzzle of financial ruin. The papers were torn into jagged strips, but the ink was still legible. I sat there under the flickering yellow light of the motel lamp, and I went to work. This was what I did. I was an engineer. I fixed things. I found the patterns in the chaos. I started piecing them together, smoothing out the wrinkles matching the torn edges. It took me an hour. But when I was done, the picture that emerged was clearer than any blueprint I had ever drawn. The first document was a letter from a collection agency in Nevada. It was addressed to Brad Coleman. Notice of default. Outstanding balance $750,000. The second document was even more interesting. It was a printout from a cryptocurrency exchange platform called BitVortex. It showed a trading history that looked like a heart attack monitor. A steep climb followed by a catastrophic drop. Account liquidation warning. Margin call. Immediate deposit required to avoid asset seizure. Amount due, $800,000. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. $1.5 million. That was the hole they had dug. I started to laugh. It was a dry, raspy sound that bounced off the thin walls of the motel room. They hadn't kicked me out because I was old. They hadn't sold the house because they wanted to downsize or because Madison wanted a fresh start. They were drowning. Brad had gambled away everything they had, and then he had gambled away everything they didn't have. They were selling my house not to get rich, but to survive. And the date on the collection letter was the key. Payment due in full by next Friday. That explained the rush. That explained why they accepted an offer below market value. That explained why they needed me gone immediately. They were desperate. They needed the cash from the closing to hit their accounts before the sharks came to collect. If they were desperate, they were sloppy. If they were in a rush, they were making mistakes. I looked at the papers again. A smile slowly spread across my face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that just realized the hunter is out of ammunition. They were on a 7-day clock. But so was I. I needed a plan, a precise surgical strike that would hit them exactly when they were most vulnerable. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone who knew the law as well as I knew concrete. I needed someone who could look at a contract and see the trapdoors. I pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in 5 years. Bennett. He was the best real estate attorney in Seattle before he retired. He was cranky, cynical, and hated everyone, which made him my favorite person in the world. He was also the only man I trusted. I pressed call. It rang 4 times. "Hello," a gruff voice answered. "If this is a robocall, I hope your server farm catches fire." "Bennett," I said. "It's Harrison." There was a pause. "Harrison Gallagher. I thought you were dead. You haven't called since Catherine's funeral." "I am not dead," I said, looking at the reconstructed letters on the table. "But I am about to be resurrected. I need your help, Bennett. I am retired Harrison. I spend my days yelling at squirrels and drinking cheap wine. Find someone else. They stole my house, Bennett. Madison and her husband. They tricked me into signing a quitclaim deed, drained my accounts, and kicked me out. I am at a Motel 6 with $12 to my name." Silence on the other end. Then a heavy sigh. "I told you that girl was trouble when she was 16, didn't I? You did. And now you want me to do what? Sue them? It will take years. You'll be dead before we even get a deposition." "I don't want to sue them. I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I want to destroy them. And I think I know how. Do you remember the subdivision we did back in 2004? The workshop expansion. There was a long silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant, dusty mind. The land lease, Bennett asked, his voice changing. He sounded interested now. Exactly. The land lease. I heard a sound that sounded like a chair scraping against a floor. I will put a pot of coffee on, Bennett said. Get over here. And bring those papers. I hung up the phone. I looked at the shattered pieces of Brad's debt on the table. I swept them into my pocket. I stood up and grabbed my coat. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a man with a map, a motive, and a very short fuse. I walked out of that motel room not as a homeless old man, but as the architect of their downfall, and construction was about to begin. I pulled up to a house that looked like it had been swallowed by ivy. Bennett lived in the older part of town, in a Victorian monstrosity that was slowly losing its battle with nature. It fit him perfectly. He was a relic, a man who had practiced law when a handshake meant something, and a contract was just a formality to confirm honor. Now he spent his days yelling at the television and drinking cheap red wine that stained his teeth. I walked up the creaking porch steps and knocked. I didn't ring the bell because I knew he had disconnected it 10 years ago to stop the Girl Scouts from selling him cookies. It took 3 minutes for the door to open. Bennett stood there in a moth-eaten cardigan and slippers that had seen better decades. He looked at me with eyes that were cloudy with cataracts, but still held that sharp, terrifying intelligence that had made him the most feared real estate attorney in Seattle. Harrison, he grunted, not stepping aside. You look like hell. I thought you were dead. Or in Florida. Which is basically the same thing. I need your help, Bennett, I said, skipping the pleasantries. He started to close the door. No. I am retired. The sign says no solicitors. That includes old friends with sad eyes. Go away. They took my house, Bennett, I said, jamming my foot in the door. Madison and her husband. They tricked me. They took the money, they took the deed, and they kicked me out. Bennett stopped pushing the door. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. He saw the cheap motel clothes. He saw the exhaustion etched into my face. He sighed, a long, rattling sound in his chest. I told you she was spoiled, he said. I told you 20 years ago, but you wouldn't listen. You just wanted to give her the world. Well, looks like she took it. He opened the door wide enough for me to slip in. The house smelled of dust and old books. We walked into his study, which was a chaotic labyrinth of stacked papers and empty wine bottles. He slumped into his leather chair and pointed to a wooden stool for me. So you want to sue them, he said, pouring himself a glass without offering me one. Good luck. If you signed a quitclaim deed, you are dead in the water. It is a valid legal instrument. Unless you can prove coercion or mental incapacity, which looking at you might be a stretch, you have nothing. Go home, Harrison. Cut your losses. You are too old for a war. I am not too old, I said, my voice rising. And I am not going home because I don't have one. I am living in a motel that charges by the hour. But that is not why I am here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the shard of wood, the piece of the music box with the pearl inlay. I placed it on the desk between us. It made a small, sharp click against the mahogany. Bennett looked at it. He frowned. What is that? It is a piece of Catherine's music box, I said quietly. The one from Vienna. The one you helped me find the repair shop for back in '95. Bennett froze. His hand hovering over his wine glass stilled. He had always had a soft spot for Catherine. I knew in the way that men know things they never speak about, that he had loved her from afar. He respected her. She was the only person who could make him laugh. What happened to it? He asked, his voice dropping an octave. Brad smashed it, I said, watching his face. He threw it on the floor because he thought it was trash. He laughed when it broke. He said Catherine's memory was just clutter. Bennett's face didn't change, but the air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He slowly put his glass down. His knuckles were white. He picked up the shard of wood. He ran his thumb over the jagged edge, dangerously close to cutting himself. He laughed. Bennett whispered. He laughed, I confirmed. Bennett stood up. He moved faster than I had seen him move in years. He didn't look frail anymore. He looked dangerous. Get up, he commanded. Where are we going? The basement, he snapped. We descended into the belly of the house. The basement was a vast, dimly lit archive of his entire career. Metal filing cabinets lined every wall, creating narrow aisles that smelled of mildew and secrets. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the bare bulb overhead. This was where he kept the bodies buried. This was where he kept the paperwork for every deal, every lawsuit, every contract he had ever drafted. He marched to the back corner, muttering to himself. Something about disrespect. Something about making them pay. He stopped in front of a rusted cabinet marked 2000-2005. You came to me in 2004, he said, yanking the drawer open. It screeched in protest. You wanted to expand the workshop in the backyard. You wanted to build a separate structure for your engineering projects. But there was a problem with the zoning. Remember, I nodded. The city wouldn't let me build a second permanent residence on the lot. Exactly, Bennett said, his fingers flying through the hanging files. Flip, flip, flip. So we got creative. We did a parcel split. We separated the land title from the improvements. We created a ground lease structure so your company could own the workshop independently of the house for tax purposes. He stopped. His hand hovered over a thick manila folder that was swollen with humidity. The tab read, Gallagher H. Project Workbench. He pulled it out. He blew the dust off the top, a gray cloud that made us both cough. He slapped the folder onto the top of a stack of old law journals and flipped it open. He scanned the first page, then the second. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face, revealing his wine-stained teeth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Harrison, he said, tapping the yellowed paper with a long, bony finger. You are a brilliant, paranoid, wonderful son of a bitch. Do you remember what we wrote in the addendum specifically regarding the transfer of the primary residence? I shook my head. It was 20 years ago. I trusted you to handle the legal mumbo-jumbo. Bennett laughed. It was a loud barking sound that echoed off the concrete walls. We wrote that the land lease for the entire lot, not just the workshop, remains with the original grantor, which is you until the expiration of the 99-year term. And here is the kicker. He turned the page and pointed to a paragraph at the bottom, circled in red ink from years ago. Clause 4B. In the event that the residential structure is sold or transferred to a third party without the express written consent of the landowner, the lease for the ground under the residence is immediately terminated. The owner of the structure, that would be your daughter now, has 48 hours to remove said structure from the land or face a penalty of $50,000 per day. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw hope. Not the soft, fuzzy kind of hope, the hard, cold iron kind. Do you understand what this means? Harrison Bennett asked, his voice trembling with excitement. They own the house, they own the wood, the bricks, the windows. But they don't own the dirt it sits on. You do. And you just evicted their house from your planet. I looked at the document. I looked at the date, 2004. The year I thought I was just saving on taxes. I had inadvertently built a doomsday device under my own home. Bennett slammed the folder shut and tucked it under his arm. Let's go, he said, heading for the stairs. I need a shower, a shave, and my best suit. We have a closing to crash. And Harrison? I looked back at him. You drive. I've had too much wine. But tomorrow, We are going to drink champagne. Bennett poured 2 glasses of a dark, dusty wine that tasted like blackberries and vengeance. We were sitting at his cluttered desk, the single bulb swinging gently above us, illuminating the document that was about to change everything. I watched him read, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal text, his lips moving silently. For a man who had claimed to be retired and done with the world, he looked remarkably alive. The dust of the basement seemed to settle around us like the fog of war clearing to reveal the battlefield. "You really don't remember this, do you?" he asked, looking over the rim of his glasses. I shook my head. "It was 20 years ago, Bennett. I was busy building bridges. I left the paperwork to you. I remember I wanted to build the workshop, and the city gave me hell about lot coverage ratios. You told me you fixed it. I didn't ask how." Bennett chuckled, a dry sound like leaves scraping against pavement. He tapped the yellowed paper with a long, bony finger. "I didn't just fix it, Harrison. I insulated it. See, back in 2004, you were taking on some high-risk structural consultations. You were worried that if a bridge fell down somewhere, they would come after your personal assets. They would come after the house." I nodded slowly. The memory was coming back. I had been terrified of losing the home Catherine loved so much because of a professional error. "Exactly," Bennett continued. "So to protect the asset, we did something called a severance of title. It is a technique usually reserved for commercial skyscrapers in New York or London, not residential homes in Seattle. But I was feeling creative that year." He took a sip of wine and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We split the Adam Harrison. We legally separated the physical structure of the house from the land it sits on. We created 2 distinct legal parcels. Parcel A is the improvements, meaning the house, the garage, the driveway, anything man-made. Parcel B is the land itself, the dirt, the rock, the geography." I stared at him, my engineer's brain trying to visualize the legal schematic. "So they are 2 different things." "Legally, yes," Bennett said. "Then we had you, Harrison Gallagher, the individual, transfer the land ownership to a holding company, Harrison Engineering Holdings LLC. A company you formed, used for 3 years, and then let go dormant. But you never dissolved it, and you never transferred the land back." He pulled another document from the file. It was a thick contract titled Ground Lease Agreement. Since the house and the land had different owners, we needed a lease. The owner of the house had to pay rent to the owner of the land. But since you were both people, we set the rent at $1 a year. It was a formality. A paper shield. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking. "So when Madison made me sign that quitclaim deed 3 months ago," Bennett slammed his hand on the desk, making me jump. "That is the beauty of it. The quitclaim deed she printed off the internet. It uses the standard county description for the residential address. It transfers all right, title, and interest in the improvements located at that address. She owns the house. She owns the roof she sleeps under. She owns the walls she hangs her expensive art on. But she does not own the ground. She is a tenant. And you, my friend, or rather your company, is the landlord." He flipped to the back of the lease agreement. He circled a paragraph with a red pen, pressing down so hard the tip almost tore the paper. "And this is the nuclear button," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Clause 4B, assignment and transfer. Listen to this." He cleared his throat and began to read with the dramatic flair of a Shakespearean actor. "The lessee shall not assign this lease or sell, transfer, or otherwise convey the ownership of the improvements to any third party without the prior express written consent of the lessor. Any attempt to transfer ownership of the improvements without such consent shall constitute an immediate material breach of this lease." He looked up at me. "Do you know what happens when there is a material breach of a ground lease, Harrison?" I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "It means the lease is terminated," Bennett said. "Instantly. It means the structure is no longer authorized to be on the land. It becomes a trespassing object. It means the landlord has the right to demand the immediate removal of the encroaching structure or to seize it as abandoned property. He sat back, looking satisfied. Madison didn't do a title search. She just assumed that because she had the deed to the house, she had the whole package. She is trying to sell a house that she has no right to keep on that land. She is selling a car that is parked in someone else's garage, and the garage owner just locked the door. I looked at the papers. I touched the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my signature from 20 years ago. I had saved myself without even knowing it. I had built a fail-safe into the very foundation of my life, a safety valve that had sat waiting for 2 decades for this exact moment. So I said, my voice steady now. If she tries to sell it to this buyer on Friday, she can't. Bennett interrupted. Well, she can try. She can sign the papers. She can take the money. But the moment she signs that bill of sale, she violates the lease. The buyer will own a house that he has to move immediately. And since you can't exactly pick up a 3,000 square foot craftsman home and put it in your pocket, the deal is dead. The title is clouded. No bank will fund the mortgage. No title company will insure it. He poured more wine into my glass. You hold the cards, Harrison. All of them. You can walk into that closing and blow the whole thing sky high. You can tell them that the rent is going up. You can tell them to move the house. You can tell them that the land is not for sale. I took a sip of the wine. It didn't taste like dust anymore. It tasted like victory. I thought about Madison's face when she threw my suitcase into the puddle. I thought about Brad smashing the music box. They had treated me like I was obsolete, like I was a structural defect in their perfect life. They forgot that the structure is nothing without the foundation. Bennett, I said, standing up, I need you to draft a notice. I want it formal. I want it terrifying. I want to serve it to them in person. Bennett smiled. I am already typing it in my head. We will cite the lease. We will cite the breach. And we will demand possession of the land. But Harrison, we have to time this perfectly. If we tell them now, they might try to find a loophole. They might try to forge your signature on a land transfer. No, I said. We wait. We wait until the very last second. We wait until they are sitting at the table, the pen hovering over the check. We wait until they think they have won. And then we pull the rug out from under them. I looked around the basement. It wasn't a dusty archive anymore. It was a command center. They sold the house, I said, feeling the weight of the words. But I am holding the ground, and on Friday the earth is going to shake. Bennett raised his glass. To the ground, he said. To the ground, I replied. I walked out of Bennett's house into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of the moon. I wasn't going back to the motel to sleep. I had work to do. I had to find a suit. I had to look the part. I wasn't the homeless father anymore. I was the landlord, and rent was due. I sat in the cab of my truck, parked in the shadow of a Home Depot, staring at my phone as if it were a bomb I had to detonate. My hands were gripping the steering wheel, not out of fear, but out of the sheer effort it took to contain the rage boiling in my gut. I had the plan. I had the legal ammunition. But to fire the shot, I needed to be on the battlefield. I needed to get back onto that property without the police dragging me away in handcuffs. I had to become an actor. I had to play the role they had written for me. The pathetic, broken, senile old man who had lost everything. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I have lifted steel beams and calculated load-bearing walls for skyscrapers, but swallowing my pride that morning felt heavier than any concrete slab. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump, forcing the tremble into my hands. I dialed Madison's number. It rang 3 times. I imagined her looking at the screen, debating whether to answer, probably rolling her eyes at Brad across the breakfast table. "What do you want, Dad?" She answered, her voice sharp and impatient. I am meeting the staging company in 20 minutes. I don't have time for a guilt trip. I let a silence hang in the air, a long, uncomfortable pause that I knew would make her squirm. "Maddie," I whispered, making my voice crack. "Please. It is the motel. I can't stay there. There are bugs in the bed, and I ran out of money for food." I heard her sigh. It was a sound of annoyance, not sympathy. "Dad, we went over this. The money is gone. You need to apply for state assistance. I can't keep bailing you out." "I am not asking for money," I said, injecting a tone of desperate pleading into my voice. "I just want to come home, not to the house. I know it is not mine anymore. I just want to stay in the potting shed in the backyard. Just for a few days, until I can figure things out." I heard movement on the other end, muffled voices. She was talking to Brad. Then the phone changed hands. "Listen." Harrison Brad's voice came through loud and arrogant. "We are not running a homeless shelter. The new owners are coming for the final walkthrough on Friday morning. We can't have you wandering around looking like a vagrant. It ruins the aesthetic." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. I had to offer them something they couldn't resist. I had to appeal to their greed and their laziness. "I know, Brad. I know," I stammered. "But the garden. I drove by yesterday. The hedges are overgrown. The hydrangeas are dead. The lawn is full of weeds. If the new owners see that they might delay the closing." There was silence. I had hooked him. Brad was lazy. He wouldn't lift a finger to do yard work, and he was too cheap to hire a professional landscaper now that he was broke. "I can fix it." I continued, rushing my words like a man begging for a lifeline. "I will prune everything. I will mow the lawn. I will make the curb appeal perfect. I will work all day and night. Just let me sleep in the shed. Please. I will be invisible." I held my breath. This was the gamble. If he said no, I would have to break in, and that was risky. I heard him laugh. It was a cruel, satisfied sound. "You really are desperate, aren't you, old man?" "Yes," I whispered. "I am." "Fine," Brad said. "You can come back. But listen to me closely. You stay in the shed. You don't come into the main house. You don't talk to the neighbors. And you better make that yard look like a magazine cover. If I see one dandelion when the buyers arrive on Friday, I am calling the cops and having you thrown in a cell. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. "Thank you, Brad. Thank you." He hung up without saying goodbye. I lowered the phone and stared at the blank screen. The mask dropped. The pathetic old man vanished, and Harrison Gallagher returned. I didn't feel shame for begging. I felt the cold precision of a general moving his troops into position. They thought they were getting free labor. They thought they were exploiting a helpless father one last time. They had no idea they had just invited the enemy inside the gates. I started the truck and put it in gear. I drove into the Home Depot parking lot. I didn't go to the gardening section. I didn't buy a rake. I didn't buy fertilizer. I walked straight to the paint aisle. I bought 2 gallons of industrial marking paint, bright fluorescent red, the kind they use to mark crime scenes or condemned buildings. Then I went to the tool aisle and bought a 300-foot surveyor's tape measure and a laser level. I paid with the last bit of cash I had found in the ashtray of the truck. I drove back to the house. It was raining again, a light drizzle that made the world look gray. I pulled into the driveway right past the sleek cars parked in front of the garage. I saw the curtain in the living room twitch. Madison was watching. She was probably checking to make sure I looked sufficiently defeated. I parked near the back gate. I got out hunched over, dragging my feet. I pulled my coat collar up as if I were trying to hide from the world. I walked to the potting shed, a small wooden structure I had built years ago to store Catherine's gardening tools. It was cold and smelled of damp earth, but it was dry. I set my supplies down on the workbench. I looked out the dusty window at the house. I could see Brad in the kitchen pouring himself a drink. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had won the lottery. He had no idea that the lottery ticket was about to explode in his face. I waited until the lights in the main house went out. I waited until the only light came from the street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement. I stepped out of the shed. I didn't pick up a pair of shears. I picked up the tape measure. I walked to the corner of the property, to the iron stake I had driven into the ground 20 years ago, hidden now by overgrown ivy. I found it. I hooked the end of the tape measure onto the metal loop. I began to walk. I walked the perimeter of the lot, moving with the steady, measured pace of an engineer. I wasn't guessing. I was verifying. I checked the coordinates against the memory of the blueprints burned into my mind. I reached the point where the house foundation met the earth. This was the line, the invisible legal wall that Bennett and I had erected 2 decades ago. I put the tape measure down. I picked up the can of red paint. I shook it. The metal ball inside rattled like the bones of the past. I knelt down in the wet grass. I wasn't there to cut the weeds. I wasn't there to plant flowers. I was there to draw a line in the sand. I pressed the nozzle. A bright, angry crimson stripe appeared on the grass. I started to paint. I painted a thick, undeniable red line that ran parallel to the house exactly 1 inch from the foundation. I painted around the flower beds. I painted across the paved walkway. I painted right up to the front porch steps. I was marking the kill zone. Brad wanted me to clean the yard for the new owners. He wanted me to show them exactly what they were buying. Well, I was going to show them. I was going to show them exactly where their property ended and where my vengeance began. I worked through the night, a shadow moving in the darkness, armed with paint and geometry. By the time the sun began to rise on Friday morning, the house was surrounded. It sat inside a red ring, isolated, cut off from the earth it stood on. I stood back and wiped the sweat from my forehead. My hands were stained red. It looked like blood. I went back to the shed and sat on a bucket watching the sun come up over the roof of the house that was no longer a home. It was Friday, the day of the sale, the day of the closing. The buyers were coming. Madison and Brad were waking up expecting a manicured lawn. They were in for a shock. The Trojan horse was in the courtyard and the soldiers were pouring out. I worked through the morning mist with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. The sun climbed higher, burning off the damp Seattle chill, but I didn't stop. I measured, I marked, and I painted. The bright red line I was drawing around the house wasn't just paint. It was a declaration of war written in the only language the law would understand: boundaries. I moved along the west side of the house, the side facing the ocean view that Madison loved to brag about. I laid the tape measure down, ensuring it was exactly 1 inch from the foundation slab. I shook the can of industrial marking paint. It hissed as I sprayed, leaving a thick, blood-red scar across the manicured green lawn. It was ugly. It was jarring. And it was perfect. By noon, I had circled 3/4 of the house. The red line was a continuous loop, a noose tightening around the neck of their fraudulent sail. I was on my knees near the front porch, carefully painting around a rose bush, when the front door flew open. Brad stormed out. He was wearing sunglasses and holding a mimosa, looking every inch the lord of the manor. But when he saw the red stripe cutting across his perfect walkway, he stopped dead. He lowered his sunglasses, his face twisting in confusion and anger. "What the hell are you doing, Harrison?" he shouted, spilling a bit of his drink. "You are supposed to be weeding, not turning the lawn into a crime scene." I didn't look up. I kept spraying, finishing the line to the edge of the stairs. I capped the can and stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my dirty trousers. I looked him in the eye, keeping my face blank. devoid of the malice burning inside me. "Just being precise, Brad," I said, my voice calm and servile. "You said you wanted the edging perfect for the new owners. I am marking the cut lines for the trimmer. I want to make sure I don't clip the siding or the foundation. You know how particular I am." Brad stared at the line. It was too thick, too bright to be a landscaping guide. But he didn't know about land leases. He didn't know about title severance. To him, it was just the eccentric behavior of a senile old man trying to be helpful. "It looks like graffiti," he snapped. "You better scrub that off before Friday." "I can't," I said, feigning innocence. "It is permanent marking paint. But don't worry. Once I trim the grass back, it will be hidden. It is just a guide. Trust me. It will look immaculate." Brad scoffed. He kicked at the line with his expensive loafer. "Whatever. Just get it done. And stay out of sight. The buyers are coming for a drive-by inspection in an hour. If they see a crazy old man with spray paint, the deal is off and you are back on the street." He turned and went back inside, slamming the door. I watched him go. He had walked right over the line. He had stepped from my land onto his house completely unaware that he had just crossed a border that was about to close forever. I went back to the shed and waited. An hour later, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Madison's SUV. It was the buyer. Mr. Sterling. I watched through the dirty window of the shed. Sterling was a large man in a tailored suit that cost more than my truck. He got out of the car, followed by a nervous-looking real estate agent. He walked up the driveway, his eyes scanning the property, with the critical gaze of a man who buys things just to say he owns them. He stopped at the walkway. He looked down. The red line was glowing in the afternoon sun. It cut right across the slate tiles of the path, a violent interruption in the elegance of the entrance. Sterling frowned. He pointed at the line. He said something to the agent. The agent shrugged, looking flustered. Sterling walked along the side of the house, following the red stripe. He saw how it hugged the foundation, how it separated the structure from the garden. He stopped near the hydrangeas I had planted for Catherine. He looked at the house, then at the ground, then at the line. He scratched his chin. He looked uneasy. It was a subtle shift, but I saw it. The confidence of the buyer was wavering. He sensed something was wrong. He sensed that this property came with baggage that wasn't listed on the disclosure forms. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't go inside. He just stood there for a long time, staring at the red paint, as if trying to decipher a code. Then he turned around, got back in his car, and drove away without a word. I sat back on my bucket in the shed and smiled. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now I just had to wait for it to grow. The trap was set. The line was drawn. And tomorrow, the jaws would snap shut. The sun went down, but the house didn't sleep. Instead, it erupted into a cacophony of noise and artificial light that felt like an insult to the quiet dignity this home had maintained for 40 years. It was Thursday night, the eve of the closing. Madison and Brad had decided that the best way to say goodbye to the house was to fill it with strangers and drown it in expensive champagne. They called it a farewell party, but as I stood in the corner of the kitchen polishing crystal glasses that used to belong to my mother, I knew what it really was. It was a victory lap. They were celebrating the heist of the century, and the victim was washing the dishes. Brad had made it very clear what my role was for the evening. Since they had fired the cleaning lady to save money, and since they were too cheap to hire a caterer, I was the help. I was the old man in the corner who refilled the ice bucket and cleared away the empty plates. I wore my old work trousers and a button-down shirt that was fraying at the collar, moving like a shadow among the guests who were dressed in silk and designer suits. These were not friends. They were vultures. They were Brad's gambling buddies who smelled of desperation and cologne, and Madison's socialite acquaintances who looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, if they looked at me at all. I walked into the living room with a fresh bottle of wine. The room was packed. The air was thick with the smell of perfume and greed. Madison was standing in the center of the room holding court. She looked beautiful, I had to admit. She had Catherine's eyes and my chin. But the spirit inside her was something foreign, something twisted by the entitlement I had foolishly fed her whole life. She was laughing at a joke I couldn't hear, her head thrown back, exposing the long line of her neck. "Everyone listen up," she shouted, tapping a spoon against her glass. The room went quiet. The music lowered. All eyes turned to her, including mine. "I just want to propose a toast," she said, her voice slurring slightly from the 3 glasses she had already consumed. "To this house." It was a dusty, creaky old thing, but it served its purpose. And now it has given us the greatest gift of all. "Freedom, hear, hear," Brad shouted from the couch, raising his glass. Tomorrow morning, Madison continued, sweeping her arm around the room, as if she were a queen addressing her subjects. We signed the papers. $2 million. Cash. We are finally getting what we deserve. We are leaving the past behind and stepping into a future where we don't have to worry about leaky roofs or outdated plumbing or... She paused, her eyes flickering to where I stood in the shadows, or dead weight. The room erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, sharp sound. They knew who she was talking about. I was the dead weight. I was the outdated plumbing. I stood there, gripping the neck of the wine bottle so hard I thought the glass might shatter in my hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the bottle into the fireplace and watch the flames consume their arrogance. I wanted to tell them that the leaky roof she complained about was the roof I had fixed in a thunderstorm when she was 6 years old so her teddy bears wouldn't get wet. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw the bottle. I walked forward, my face a mask of absolute submission, and I poured wine into the empty glass of a man who didn't even say thank you. I was playing the long game. And in the long game, you have to be willing to lose a few hands to win the pot. I retreated back to the kitchen. The noise of the party was a dull roar through the swinging door. I leaned against the cold granite counter, the counter where Catherine used to roll out cookie dough on Sundays. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was the only light in the dark corner where I stood. I opened my messages. I found Bennett's name. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could hear Brad's voice rising above the others in the other room, bragging about the trip to Europe they were planning, about the new cars they were going to buy. They were spending the money before the ink was even wet. They were so sure of themselves. They were so confident that the old man was defeated, that the laws of gravity didn't apply to them. I typed 3 words, 6 a.m., initiate. I pressed send. The message swooshed away, a digital arrow flying into the night, aiming for the heart of their scheme. I put the phone back in my pocket and felt a strange sense of peace. It was done. The mechanism was armed. The timer was ticking down. The party dragged on for hours. I watched them get drunker. I watched them get sloppier. I saw the way Brad looked at Madison, not with love, but with the hungry eyes of an addict looking at his supplier. He didn't love her. He loved the lifeline she was handing him. And tomorrow, when I cut that lifeline, I wondered if he would stick around to watch her drown. By 1 in the morning, the last guests had stumbled out to their Ubers. The house was a wreck. Empty bottles littered the tables like fallen soldiers. Stains of red wine marred the white carpet stains that Madison would have screamed about yesterday, but tonight she didn't care. She had $2 million coming in the morning. She could buy a new carpet. She could buy a new house. I was in the hallway picking up a shattered glass when Brad came out of the bathroom. He was swaying. His tie was undone, hanging loose around his neck like a noose. He saw me on my knees picking up the shards. He stopped. He looked down at me. A sneer curled his lip. He looked like a man who had conquered the world and found it boring. "You missed a spot, old man," he muttered, kicking at a piece of glass near my hand. I picked it up carefully, placing it on the tray. I didn't look up. Go to bed, Brad, I said quietly. You have a big day tomorrow. You are damn right I do, he said, leaning against the wall to steady himself. Tomorrow I become a rich man. And you become a memory. He pushed himself off the wall and stumbled toward me. He stopped right in front of me, looming over my kneeling form. Listen to me, Harrison, he hissed, his breath smelling of stale champagne and malice. Once we sign those papers tomorrow, I don't want to see your face again. You take your truck, you take your pathetic clothes, and you get back to that Roach Motel. If I see you on this property after noon, I will have you arrested. Do you hear me? You are done. He drew his foot back and kicked me. It wasn't a hard kick, just a lazy, disrespectful shove of his shoe against my shin. But the intent was clear. He was kicking a dog. He was kicking the trash. I took the hit. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry out. I slowly stood up, holding the tray of broken glass. I looked him in the eye. My eyes were level with his now. He blinked, surprised by the sudden lack of fear in my gaze. He expected me to cower. He expected the beaten dog to whimper. But the dog wasn't beaten. The dog was just waiting for the command to bite. I smiled. It was a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. You are right, Brad, I said softly. Tomorrow is going to be a day to remember. And don't worry. By noon, one of us will definitely be gone from this property forever. Brad laughed, a wet, sloppy sound. Yeah. You. Now get out of my sight. You smell like failure. He turned and staggered up the stairs, laughing to himself. I watched him go. I watched him disappear into the master bedroom, the room that used to be mine. I turned off the lights in the hallway. The house plunged into darkness. Outside, the red line I had painted around the foundation was invisible in the night, but I could feel it. I could feel it glowing like a laser beam cutting through the dark, waiting for the sun to rise and reveal the trap. I went out to the potting shed. I didn't sleep. I sat on my bucket listening to the silence, waiting for the dawn. The celebration was over. The hangover was about to begin, and I was going to be the one serving it ice cold. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours in the potting shed, shaving with cold water, and putting on the suit Bennett had brought me. It was one of his old ones, a charcoal gray wool, that was slightly too big in the shoulders, but it was clean and it smelled of authority. I tied the tie with steady hands. The man in the small cracked mirror wasn't a victim anymore. He was the executioner. At 8:55, I saw Bennett's vintage Jaguar pull up to the curb. He stepped out carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. He nodded at me. It was time. We walked up the driveway together. Through the living room window, I could see them. Madison, Brad, the real estate agent, and Mr. Sterling, the buyer. They were sitting around the dining room table. There was a bottle of champagne chilling in a silver bucket. They were smiling. They were about to sign their lives away. I didn't knock. I opened the front door and walked in. The conversation inside stopped instantly. The silence was absolute. Madison's smile froze on her face. Brad looked up, his eyes widening in shock and then narrowing in anger. "What are you doing here?" Brad shouted, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I told you to stay in the shed until we were done. Get out!" Mr. Sterling looked confused. He looked from me to Brad. "Who is this? This is just the gardener," Madison said quickly, her voice high and frantic. "He is a bit senile. Dad, please go back outside. We are in the middle of a meeting." I didn't move. I walked to the head of the table. Bennett followed me, his face a mask of professional boredom. "I am not the gardener," I said, my voice calm, filling the room. "And I am not leaving, because you can't sell something that doesn't belong to you." "Excuse me," Mr. Sterling asked, putting his pen down. "What is he talking about?" "He is crazy," Brad yelled, coming around the table toward me. "He is my father-in-law. He has dementia. I am calling the police right now." "Sit down, Brad," Bennett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of 50 years of courtroom battles. "Unless you want to be arrested for fraud in front of these witnesses, I suggest you sit down and listen." Brad stopped. He looked at Bennett, then at the briefcase. Uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He sat down. Bennett walked to the table. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his briefcase and took out a large rolled-up document. He unrolled it on the table right on top of the closing papers. It was the original survey map from 2004. He then placed a thick, yellowed contract next to it. The ground lease agreement. "What is this?" Madison asked, her voice trembling. "This," Bennett said, pointing to the map, "is a survey of the land you are sitting on. And this contract is the reason you are all about to have a very bad day." He looked at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Arthur Bennett. I represent Harrison Engineering Holdings, LLC. My client, Mr. Gallagher here, is the sole owner of this land. All of it. From the street to the back fence." Madison laughed. It was a nervous, hysterical sound. "That is a lie. We have the deed. We have the title to the house." "You do," Bennett agreed. "You have the deed to the structure, the house, the bricks, the wood, but you do not own the land beneath it." He tapped the contract. 20 years ago, Mr. Gallagher severed the title. He kept the land and leased the usage rights to the homeowner. It is a ground lease, and like all leases, it has rules. He flipped the page to the section circled in red. Clause 4B, Bennett read aloud. "Any attempt to sell or transfer the improvements to a third party without the written consent of the landowner constitutes an immediate breach of contract." I stepped forward. I looked at Madison. She was pale. She was starting to understand. "I didn't give my consent." "Madison," I said softly. Bennett continued. "The moment you signed the listing agreement with this agent, you triggered a default. But the moment you attempt to sign that bill of sale today, you trigger the termination clause." "Termination," Brad whispered. Bennett nodded. "The lease is dead. It expired 5 minutes ago when you confirmed your intent to sell. And since the lease is terminated, the structure is now trespassing on my client's land." I walked to the window. I pulled the curtains back. The bright red line I had painted yesterday was glowing in the morning sun. It circled the house like a crime scene tape. "Do you see that red line?" I asked, pointing. "That is the property line. Everything inside that line is the house you're trying to sell. Everything outside that line is my land." I turned back to them. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking. "Since you are no longer tenants, I am exercising my right as the landlord. I want my land back, clear and empty." I looked at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, if you buy this house, you are buying a pile of wood that is illegally parked on my property. And I am giving the owners exactly 48 hours to remove it." "Remove it," Sterling sputtered. "You mean, move the house? I mean, pick it up and take it somewhere else," I said. "Because if it is still here on Sunday at noon, I will start charging rent. And since it is an unauthorized commercial structure on residential land, the penalty rate as per the contract is $50,000 a day." $50,000, Brad choked out. Sterling stood up. His face was red. He looked at the papers in front of him. Then he looked at Brad. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Does he own the land? I didn't know," Brad stammered. "We have the deed. It says we own the property." "It says you own the improvements," Bennett corrected sharply. "You should have read the title report more carefully, or maybe you should have just treated your landlord with a little more respect." Sterling didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed the check he had written, a cashier's check, for $2 million. He ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was louder than a gunshot. He threw the pieces in Brad's face. "You tried to sell me a house with no land," Sterling roared. "You tried to scam me." No. No, Madison cried, grabbing Sterling's arm. We didn't know. We can fix this. Dad, tell him we can fix this. I looked at my daughter. She was crying now. Real tears. Not because she was sorry, but because the money was disappearing. There is nothing to fix, I said cold. The deal is dead. Sterling turned to Brad. He drew back his hand and slapped him. It was a hard, open-palmed strike that echoed through the room. Brad's head snapped to the side. A red mark bloomed instantly on his cheek. You are hearing from my lawyers, Sterling spat. Attempted fraud. Wasting my time. He stormed out of the house. The front door slammed shut, shaking the walls. The room was silent again. But the air was heavy with the wreckage of their dreams. Brad sat in his chair holding his cheek, looking at the torn check on the table. Madison was sobbing into her hands. Bennett closed his briefcase. The click of the latches was final. Well, he said, my work here is done. Harrison. I will be in the car. He walked out, leaving me alone with them. I looked at the champagne bucket. The ice was melting. The celebration was over before it began. Madison looked up at me. Her mascara was running down her face. She looked like a child again. A child who had broken something she couldn't fix. Dad, she whispered. Why? Why would you do this? I walked over to the table. I picked up the pen they were going to use to sign the papers. I turned it over in my fingers. You asked me why I painted the line, I said. I told you it was to mark the edge. You just didn't realize I was marking the edge of my tolerance. You ruined us, Brad whispered, staring at the table. We owe money. Real money. If we don't pay by Monday... That sounds like a tenant problem, I said. Not a landlord problem. Madison stood up. She screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of panic. Dad, you don't understand. They will kill us, the people Brad owes. They aren't banks. You have to help us. You have to give us the land. I looked at her. I remembered the day she was born. I remembered holding her and promising to protect her from the world. But I realized now that the only way to protect her was to let her face the consequences of her own actions. I can't give you the land, Madison, I said. It belongs to the company, and the company has strict rules about leasing to people who evict their fathers. I turned to walk away. Dad, she screamed again. You are killing me. You are killing your own daughter. I stopped at the door. I didn't turn around. No, Madison. I am just teaching you the one thing I forgot to teach you when you were a child. What? She sobbed. That you never tear down the foundation that holds you up, I said. I opened the door and walked out into the sunshine. Behind me, I heard the sound of glass shattering. Madison had thrown the champagne bottle against the wall. It didn't matter. It wasn't my wall anymore. It was just a structure on my land. And their time was ticking. Tick-tock. 48 hours. I got into Bennett's car. He looked at me and smiled. Did you tell them about the eviction notice, he asked. I saved that for Monday, I said. Let them have the weekend to pack. We drove away, leaving the red line glowing in the distance. The war was over, and the good guys had won. We watched from the curb as Mr. Sterling's car disappeared around the corner. The silence he left behind was heavy, but it didn't last long. In the distance, the wail of sirens began to rise, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the morning air. I saw Brad freeze. He knew that sound. He knew what it meant. Bennett hadn't just uncovered a land lease violation. In his digging, he had found the fraudulent loan applications Brad had filed, the forged signatures on the crypto accounts, and the Ponzi scheme he had been running to keep his gambling addiction afloat. Bennett had made a phone call to the district attorney before we even walked into the house. Two police cruisers screeched into the driveway, blocking Madison's SUV. Officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters. They didn't knock. They walked straight up the path, stepping over the red line I had painted, and entered the open front door. I walked back toward the porch. I needed to see this. I needed to see the end of the infection that had almost killed my family. Inside, chaos had erupted. Brad was being pressed against the wall by two officers. He was screaming, his face twisted into a mask of pure cowardice. It wasn't me, he yelled, spit flying from his mouth. It was her, it was Madison. She is the one who wanted to sell. She signed the papers. I am just the husband. I didn't know anything. I looked at Madison. She was standing in the middle of the living room, watching the man she had married, the man she had betrayed her father for. Throw her to the wolves without a second thought. She looked small. She looked broken. The arrogance that had defined her for years evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child. The officers dragged Brad out. As he passed me, he didn't look at me with anger anymore. He looked at me with fear. He knew that I wasn't the old man he could push around. I was the wall he had crashed into. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser. The doors slammed shut, sealing his fate. The sirens chirped, and then they were gone, taking the noise and the malice with them. I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing. The house was quiet again. The red paint on the lawn seemed to pulse in the sunlight. Madison walked out slowly. She wasn't wearing her shoes. She stood on the cold slate of the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were freezing. She looked at the empty driveway where her husband had just been taken away. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were red. Her makeup was ruined. She took a step toward me, and then her knees gave way. She collapsed onto the hard stone, burying her face in her hands. "Dad." She sobbed, her voice muffled and shaking. "Please, you have to help me. They are going to take everything. The car, the bank accounts. Everything is in his name, too. I have nowhere to go." I looked down at her. I waited for the pang of guilt. I waited for the fatherly instinct to rush in, to scoop her up, to tell her that I would fix it, that I would write a check and make the bad world go away. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sadness. Not for me, but for her. I had spent her entire life shielding her from consequences. When she forgot her homework, I drove it to school. When she overspent on her credit card, I paid the bill. When she chose a man who was clearly wrong for her, I paid for the wedding. I had thought I was loving her, but I wasn't. I was crippling her. I had raised a bonsai tree, clipping her roots so she could never grow strong enough to stand on her own. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a plain white envelope. I had prepared it last night in the potting shed, writing the address by the light of my phone. "Madison," I said. My voice was calm, steady, like the earth beneath my feet. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. She saw the envelope. She thought it was a check. She thought it was money. She reached for it with trembling hands. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't leave me. I knew you loved me." I handed her the envelope. She tore it open, her fingers fumbling in her haste. She pulled out the papers inside. Her face fell. It wasn't a check. It wasn't cash. It was a brochure for a rehabilitation center in Vermont that specialized in shopping addiction and narcissistic behavioral therapy. Clipped to it was a single sheet of paper, an employment application for a receptionist position at Mike's Auto Body Shop, a garage owned by an old friend of mine. It was minimum wage, hard work, honest work. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion. "This is my offer," I said. "I don't understand," she cried. "I need money, Dad. I need a lawyer. I need a place to stay." I shook my head. "You had a place to stay. You had a home. You chose to treat it like a commodity. You chose to treat me like an obstacle." I pointed to the red line on the lawn. "That line is real, Madison. You crossed it. You can't come back across it just because it started raining. I stepped closer to her. I wanted her to hear this. I wanted her to remember this moment for the rest of her life. I am not giving you money, I said, because money is what made you sick. I am giving you a chance to go to that center and figure out why you felt the need to fill the hole in your soul with expensive things. And if you finish that program, Mike is expecting you. He will give you a job. You will answer phones. You will sweep floors. You will learn what $1 actually feels like when you have to sweat for it. She stared at the papers, tears dripping onto the application. But where will I live? She whispered. I don't know, I said. That is for you to figure out. You are 38 years old, Madison. It is time you started living your own life instead of feeding off mine. I turned toward the front door. My hand rested on the brass knob. It felt cold and solid. Dad, she screamed, scrambling to her feet. You can't do this. I am your daughter. You are supposed to take care of me. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I am taking care of you, I said. I am letting you hit the bottom, because the bottom is the only place solid enough to build a foundation on. I opened the door and walked inside. I closed it firmly behind me. I heard her pounding on the wood for a minute, screaming my name. Then the pounding stopped. I heard her footsteps retreating down the driveway. She was gone. I walked through the quiet house. I walked past the spot where the music box had shattered. I would fix the floor later. I went into the kitchen and put a kettle on the stove. I waited for the whistle. I poured a cup of tea, Earl Grey, just the way Catherine used to like it. I walked out the back door to the porch overlooking the garden. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh paint. I sat down in the rocking chair. I took a sip of the hot tea. It burned my tongue, a sharp grounding sensation. I was alone. The house was empty. My bank accounts were still drained, though Bennett assured me the fraud investigation would eventually recover most of it. My daughter was gone. My son-in-law was in jail. By all accounts, I had lost my family. But as I looked out at the hydrangeas, seeing the droplets of water glistening on their petals like diamonds, I didn't feel lost. I felt light. The weight of the lies, the weight of the disrespect, the weight of trying to buy their love, it was all gone. I had defended my dignity. I had protected the legacy Catherine and I built. I had stood up when the world told me to sit down and die. I took another sip of tea. It tasted like freedom. I was lonely, yes, but I was the master of my own domain. I was the landlord of my own soul. And for the first time in a long time, the foundation felt strong enough to hold whatever came next. The most painful lesson I learned in 70 years is that sometimes the people who share your DNA are not the people who deserve your loyalty. We are taught that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water. But blood can be toxic. Blood can carry a disease that rots you from the inside out if you don't treat it. I learned that respect is the only currency that matters in a relationship. If someone withdraws from your account without depositing respect, they are bankrupting you no matter how much you love them. You have to be willing to close the account. You have to be willing to draw the red line and say, "This is my land. You do not cross." It is better to be alone in a house built on truth than to be surrounded by people in a castle built on lies. If you have ever had to make the hard choice to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments below. It is not an easy path, but you are not walking it alone. Please hit the like button if you believe that dignity has no price tag, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing your ground. Thank you for listening. I am Harrison Gallagher, and I am finally home.